All right, folks, let's get this thing rolling. I'm going to hit mute alls so we don't have too much background noise. And let's dive in. So again, feel free to use that chat window. So today, remind me if I get lost, but there's a few things we want to cover. So we'll do a little brief review of what we've talked about before, just a couple minutes here at the beginning. Then we're going to dive into black and white conversions. We're going to do some localized color adjustments. We're going to talk about noise and sharpening. And then we will do some multi-image panoramas and HDR stuff. So it's a fair amount to cover in 1 hour here, but let's see what we can get done. So let's dive into Lightroom. Okay, collapse this out of the way. All right, so here we are. Let me get into the place we wanted to talk about. So, again, just wanted to briefly review. This is the library module. So this is where all the organizations happens. We've talked about all of the different colors that you can use to kind of code your images. I find that a really useful tool for organizing how I am. If I want to pull up all my green images, I know they're images that I've completed. If I want to pull up purple images, I know it's ones that I'm setting aside for a specific purpose. So there's a number of things that we can sort of do to help us organize our images. One of the things I haven't mentioned is that you can also star your images. So you notice when I hover over the bottom part of my image here, I get these 4 dots. There's a couple ways to do it, but one of the ways is, so if I like this image pretty well, but it's not absolutely one of my best, I can give that 4 stars. And that allows me another way to search for different images. So you can rate your own images, so you give yourself a grade and keep track of how things are. Collections over here, we've already discussed, and I use them a lot. You can see I have a lot of collections here that pull out images into smaller groups, one of which is the ones we're going to deal with today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is black and white conversions. And so I'm going to pull up this image, which I think is going to work pretty well as a black and white. And you can see it was the first thing when you're thinking about black and white is to think about it in the field. Before you come into the camera, the most successful black and white images are ones that when we were in the field, we saw them in black and white. So, we looked at that shot and say, that's going to look good in black and white. And when we think in black and white, it's a lot better than just playing around with it after the fact. So if you just kind of are, let's pull the color out of this and see what it looks like, I think you're less likely to be successful than if you capture an image in the field and say, okay, this is going to be a black and white photo. The day I made this shot, it was on the lower Noatak River in Northwest Alaska. Found this beautiful set of caribou, this beautiful caribou skull laying on the tundra. And it was, the colors you can see are pretty muted. I think it was early August, so, there wasn't a lot blooming, and it was kind of a gray day. You can see rain falling there in the background. But there's a fair amount of contrast between those bright white antlers and that kind of brownish tundra. And there's enough texture in that sky that I think we might be able to do something back there too. And so when I made this image, I was like, okay, I was pretty sure that this was likely to be a black and white, because in color, it's interesting, but it's hardly great. So there are 2 different ways that you can convert an image to black and white. I'm going to collapse this over here so we don't get distracted by that. And you can see the image a little larger. The main way to convert, so there's 2 different ways. You can see up here in the basic part of the develop module here, you see an option, one's for color and one's for black and white. If you just click that, that's the quickest way to remove color from your image. And it works great. You can do a lot of adjustments from that point, and it works just fine for a basic quick conversion. The other way to do it is to go down and simply look at the bottom of your presence section. There's your vibrance and saturation. If you take your saturation all the way off, it also removes all the color. I don't really know the reason for this, but they look a little bit different. So if I went to black and white, see how there's a little more contrast? It doesn't actually seem to change very much here. But it does seem to, for some reason or other, add a little bit of contrast, and it tends to look a little bit better if you allow Lightroom to make that decision for you. At least right off the bat, we can, in the process of our own post-processing, we can kind of improve that. So you can see the difference if you just, that's saturation removed, that's Adobe's black and white conversion. So for the interest of time, we'll just use Adobe's black and white conversion. It looks pretty good. Now, when you're thinking about your black and whites, we think about white balance here, the temperature, as not playing a role in black and white because it deals with color. But in fact, it does. Some of you guys may have started in the days of film and are probably familiar with how putting a red filter over the cover over your lens when shooting black and white could really improve the contrast and change the look of the image. Well, it's kind of the same with white balance. If you slide your white balance up and down, you can see you get pretty different looks depending on where you end up. So, if I have it all the way in the blue range, it kind of makes it quite gray, brightens the image a bit overall. But down into the warm range, where that red filter, if we've been using it, plays a role, you can see it adds some nice contrast. So here's where it started, and kind of darkened up in this corner a little bit, created some interesting textures. So you can adjust with the temp. That white balance will actually play a role in black and white photography. Tint, less so. But it also will play a role. See, as I'm sliding, you can see the image change just a little bit here and there. But that's worth messing around with as well. Now I'm going to think more specifically about this image. So as I've said throughout these classes, you need to go into your image thinking about where your points of improvement are, and where you've done well and where the image can be better. So there's a few things I know right away. I want this sky to have more drama. This is a little bit too bright here. I really want the main concentration to be here in these crazy patterns and this big old set of caribou antlers. And I want the sky to play a secondary role, but still important role in sort of setting that stage for the placement of this set of antlers. So I'm going to go through here and just do my usual back and forths, kind of quick first pass on these. I might want the overall image to be slightly darker. Contrast, probably won't mess with the contrast very much. I like to do the contrast down in these sliders in the highlights and shadows. Highlights, the highest of the highlights are in the sky. And I'm going to pull those back a little bit. We may do a little work in that foreground to retrieve some of that I just lost. Shadows, if you bring up shadows too much, it's going to start making it look gray. In a black and white image, having totally blacked out blacks, it can be okay. But I'm going to darken the shadows a touch. Whites, probably won't mess with too much, maybe down a little bit. Blacks, you can get away with a bit of black in an image like that. There we go. So, we can already see, I'm going to click down here, and you can see the difference that we've got. So this image here on the left, actually, it's kind of better where we started. That's strange. I wonder what I'm looking at here. This looks better than this. Oh, I know why. I apologize. That's going to be confusing. I'm not going to use that for this. This is a virtual copy. And so it's it's showing what it looked like after I'd processed it originally. So we're going to just kind of forget that. All right, so texture, it adds that sort of apparent sharpness. We definitely want that. Look, as I slide that up, you can see that foreground and those antlers really start to pop. Clarity will do a similar sort of thing. It'll really increase the contrast between the sharp edges and the it'll increase the contrast where lights meet darks, so along edge points. So particularly in the antlers, that's going to play a role. It'll also play a role in the background. You can see the sky get a lot more dramatic and interesting there as I slide the clarity slider. Dehaze, I'm not going to mess with on this image. I think I'll do a quick little slider to see what it looks like, but actually, Actually, that does some interesting things. That's why you always check, because you never know. A little bit of clarity or a dehaze there really brought in a fair amount of texture and interest back here. Yeah, so that actually worked pretty well. So after a first pass, we can see that we've done a pretty nice, it's become a nice conversion. Now I'm looking at it from a little more of a compositional perspective. The antlers are a touch off center, and I think I could probably use to lose just maybe a hair off of the right side of the frame, maybe a touch out of the bottom to keep it from looking too square. So I'm going to open up the crop tool. I'm going to make sure it is unlocked. See the lock icon here? If it's unlocked, it allows you to free transform it however you want. If it's locked, it will keep the format it's in. So here's locked. You can see it keeps the same format as I made the photograph in. If I unlock it, it allows me to freely transform it however I want. So I'm going to pull that out, and I'm going to pull that up. Nice. Double click accepts that, or you just close out of the crop. And now I'm looking at the rest of this, and it's looking pretty good. But I want to see what I can do with the sky. And so I am going to grab the graduated filter tool that we talked about last week. And because I have a fairly nice horizon line here, I know I'm going to be able to grab the horizon pretty accurately, if I can get this thing to be the right. There we go. So I've grabbed the horizon. The first thing I'm going to do is I think I'm going to darken that just a little bit. So let's see what that looks like when I lower the exposure. Yeah, that looks good. Maybe bring the shadows down, but most of I think what the sky needs is a bit of clarity to add some drama. Boom, there's some drama, maybe a little too much. And textural, is another way to sort of do that to a certain extent. So I'll add a little texture, although that doesn't really seem to do a whole lot for me. Dehaze, maybe, it's that hammer tool. Maybe a little bit, but I don't want to go too high. It starts to look a little strange otherwise. And there we have a pretty nice sky. I mean, I like to think of a lot of these images as if your background was a standalone image, does it look good? And obviously sharpness, doesn't matter so much, but in terms of composition and lighting, I think that background looks pretty darn good. Now, what are some things here in the foreground I might want to do? So I like how bright this front part of the antler is, but for whatever reason, either lighting in the field or perhaps it had something to do with how I post-processed, or maybe there was some some sort of lichen or growth or mold or something on the antler itself that caused this section of the antler to darken. So I think what I'm going to do is grab our good old brush tool, and using the auto mask clicked, see right there, and a fairly small feather, about 60. I am going to paint in that. I'm going to turn up my exposure so I know that I'm seeing what I want to be seeing. And you can see the mask is doing the auto mask is doing a pretty good job of just grabbing what I want, which is the antler. I'm adjusting the brush as I go to make sure that I am not grabbing too much of the surrounding. I'm doing it in lots of small brush strokes, because then if I make a mistake, if I go over here to the history, I can just go back a couple of strokes. So if I want to go back to what it looked like here, I can do that and lose those strokes, or I can put them back in. So I do it in rather than in one big brush stroke, I do it in several small brush strokes. And that looks pretty good. It's too bright, but that's just showing where I painted. And now I'm going to ease that exposure back off a little bit, probably down to about a stop. Yeah, not bad. And you can see that really adjusted. So I'm going to open up our history here and go back to where before I put that in. Oops, make that here. So you can see how gray it looks in the previous version and how much brighter it has come in. So a nice level of contrast. So from there, I think we're more or less done with what we've done in this part of the important area of the areas. We've done the sky nicely. And there's a couple of things I wanted to check on. As you're doing a lot of these adjustments, especially when you're adding light to a dark part of an image, you can introduce noise. And so I'm going to zoom in where I added the noise. I'm going to go into 2 to 1 rather, not 1 to 2. Go into a pretty tight, and you can see it's pretty clean. We'll do this on another image a little later, but there is a little bit of speckling of noise in there. The detail section of your develop module allows you to somewhat deal with noise and to sharpen. So this image is pretty sharp. I'm not very much worried about sharpening. As you decrease noise, it will reduce sharpening. And so I always do, despite the order that Lightroom presents, I always do noise first. Because then you can bring back some of the sharpness that you might lose by increasing the sharpening after you do it. So I'm going to slide the noise luminance slider up a little bit. I almost always leave the detail and the contrast to 0 and detail at 50. Otherwise, it starts to get a little strange. The detail controls how big of a pixels the noise adjustment will affect. So the lower it is, the less effect you'll see at the small end of the scale, and the more effect you'll see at the high end of the scale. I usually leave it around 50. So yeah, you can see that smoothed that out a fair amount in there. Honestly, it didn't really have enough to concern me too much, but I wanted to talk about noise there. And the last thing I'll do is, because I increased the noise reduction, I'm going to also sharpen just a touch. Almost all raw images out of camera need a little bit of sharpening, so I default my Lightroom to 25. Actually, it's set to 40, but usually I like it at 25. It's enough to give just a little bit of sharpening to an image without making it look over sharpened. And honestly, I think that looks pretty good. All right, so we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but that is the detail section. And the last thing, got somebody who wants to get in here. And then the last thing we want to do, and it looks like I've actually already adjusted this, but I'll start again from the scratch here, is the post-crop vignette down here in the effects. And definitely need some sort of vignette. So I'm going to pull down those sliders. That's pretty good. Pretty strong vignettes on black and whites tend to work pretty well because all of my area of interest is right here, dead center in the frame. You can really get away with a fair amount. Adjusting the midpoint, I'm going to turn this way down so you can see what I'm doing here. The midpoint basically changes where on the image, basically how much of the image you want to darken. So if you want a lot of most of your image to be covered by a vignette, you can take the midpoint down. I generally do, on this one, that's pretty appropriate. What the default is at 50. Feather, I've talked about this before. Feather gives you, if you increase that, it makes it more feathered. If you do less, then you get a sharp-edged vignette. I don't know why anybody would want to do that. And then the last one is highlights. If you want to retain the highlights in your vignette, you can change that up. It just keeps the vignette look from overwhelming your image. But I'm not going to use that for this. And let's bring our amount back up to a reasonable level. Yeah. So not too bad. I think we ended up, so let's go back down to what we started with. So there's the image. There's the image how we started. And here's where we ended up. Pretty good, huh? So I think that particular image works very effectively as a black and white. All right, so I saw a couple of texts coming in there. I'm going to briefly stop the screen share. Hang on. And let's see what we've got here. Oh, highlight the mouse, please. Sorry, Fred. Yes, I will do that next time around. Better to shoot in color than in black and white. Fletcher, good question. Indeed, in shooting in color, if you're shooting in RAW, you just always shoot in color. Let the camera make that decision. One thing that if you're trying to learn how to shoot in black and white, then it's great to be able to look through your images in the field and see them in black and white. But if I'm actually shooting seriously, I always shoot in color in the field and then convert later. But I try to keep it in my head with where my ultimate goal with that image is likely to be. How far can you zoom in on pixels in Lightroom? Eleanor, you can zoom way in if you want. There's plenty. You can take it in until it's just looks like a bunch of big pixels. I find the most useful ranges when you're zooming in to check things like sharpness or noise is 1:1 to 2:1. You can go into 3:1 sometimes if I'm doing some detail work, but for the most part, that level is much more effective than going way in. I can't think of any reason you'd need to get in tighter than that. Difference between sharpening and detail slider. Hang on, let me refresh my memory here. Yes. So the detail has to do with how much detail you're trying to retain in your image. So if you are, lost my train of thought. So with the sharpening, it will basically, it goes to it looks for even very small microscopic edges within your frame. You add sharpening and it will use an algorithm to detect where it gets fuzzy and try to tighten that up. The detail slider has to do with noise. So if you want to retain, when you add noise reduction, so when you're trying to reduce the amount of noise in your image, you will invariably soften the image overall. And what the detail slider does, is as you adjust that up and down, it will adjust where it's applying the noise reduction. So if you want to try to retain detail, say in the fur of an animal, then you will get some of that back by adjusting the detail slider up. So that's the difference between the sharpening and the detail slider. Briefly talk through the steps that I use to brighten the antlers. So Janice, oops, let me go back and share my screen again. And barring any other questions, we'll move on from that to the next section. Okay. So Janice, what I did for that is I grabbed the adjustment brush right here, made sure auto mask was turned on. So that check mark right there, which basically, because there's a lot of contrast and a defined edge between the antler and the tundra and the background, it's very easy for Lightroom to grab just what I need. If it is any place fuzzy or there's lots of grass overlapping the antler, it would have been a lot harder. But in this case, I knew Lightroom would have an easy job grabbing just what I needed. So I used the auto mask. And then I turned up my exposure just so I could see where I was painting, and then just brushed in using a fairly low feather and a fairly small brush. I was able to just quickly go through and paint in just the main areas that I wanted to do on the antlers. So that is how we grabbed just what we needed. Yeah, go ahead.
So it automatically makes it brighter, or did you tell it brighter somewhere?
I'll show you. So here's where I added it. So you can see that. You can see it got off a little bit in the area. So if I wanted to get in there, I could dodge that back out again. But in the interest of time, we're not going to. So that's the area I used. And then I increased, if you look over here on the right side, I increased the exposure by about 3/4 of a stop.
Oh, that's where okay, got it. I missed that.
And that's what brightened it up overall. And you can fiddle around with that a little bit.
Thanks.
All right, no problem. All right, so let's head back to the library here and find a different image. So so we talked about black and white conversions. We were going to talk about localized color adjustments, which we did a little bit last week with this image, but let's do, let me see, what should we work on? I need a color photo. I should have pulled a different one out for this. Let me go back to my main catalog and we'll find an image that will work well for that. Let's see. Well, here we could do it on that one. All right, so let's use it with this guy. All right, so here's an image of a red-winged blackbird singing. So as I look at this, let's say I wanted to, I'm going to do just a really quick pass to make it look decent, just because I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to this stuff, and I can't sit and watch images not quite look as well as I can make them before I start the more detail work. All right, highlights down a little bit, bring in some shadows to bring in some detail there. A little bit of texture to make that bird look as sharp as I can get him. Maybe a little clarity, probably not too much. A little vibrance, a little saturation. Okay, so that's better than we started anyway. So now looking at this, let's say I would like to really increase the saturation of this blue or reduce it if I find it distracting. So what I'm going to do is this section of the develop module that we have not talked about is Hsl Color. Now there's a couple of different features in here. You have hue, you have saturation, and you have luminance. So the hue will change the general tonality of the image. I generally don't play with the hue at all. I suppose there might be some specific reason, if I wanted to make that red look a little bit different color red, then I could do that. Well, let's see what that does. So, okay, here, see this little spot where there's this click? So that gives me an eyedropper kind of tool. It's not really an eyedropper, but it allows me to focus in on one pixel. Now watch this section as I move this around the frame. So if I take it down to the bottom, you can see that the blue highlight is highlighted there where the number is. If I'm here, it's black, but there's a little bit of like yellowy tones, so the yellow and oranges are flashing. If I'm right here on the bird's epaulette, then the reds and the oranges are the ones highlighted. So if I wanted to change the color of that red, I could. I put it hovering over that point, and now I'm scrolling. And you can see it's getting a lot deeper red. See, look how deep red that's turning. Now it's like getting into the magenta range. It's getting weird looking. But you can see you can adjust the hue if there is something about your image you don't like. So if I want it more yellow, I can take it up that way. But do note it's changing all of those colors in the frame. It's not localized to just that part of the bird. It is the whole frame. So see the background is losing its orange tones as I do that. So that would be a hue adjustment. And again, that's not something I really mess with very much. Saturation, however, it's pretty useful. So if I really want to, let's say I want to increase the intensity of this blue. So saturation increases the color intensity, color saturation. And so again, I'm going to hover over this blue area and I'm going to scroll it upwards. And scrolling my mouse upwards, you can see that blue getting brighter and brighter and brighter until it starts to look a little too fakey. You can see the edge starts to look awkward there. And it starts to get some blue sheen coming in on the bird. But you can make it look a bit bluer, and quite a bit bluer, without doing anything else. Let's say I wanted to increase the saturation of this yellow tone on the bird's epaulette. I can do the same thing, bringing that up. Let's say I decide I don't really like the blue at all, and I want the blue to just go away entirely. Then I can pull that down, and suddenly the water in the background there is no longer blue. So you can do these local adjustments affecting just the saturation of one color or another. Now, luminance basically, in practical terms, it changes the brightness of a color. So again, let's go down here to the blue since it covers the largest part of this frame. And I am going to increase the luminance. See how that section of my frame is getting brighter and brighter and brighter? Or I can make it darker and darker and darker, which actually might be the way to go with this image. So that is how those localized color adjustments can be used. And I don't use it on every image, but on some images, it's a particularly useful little trait. The other thing I wanted to talk about with color adjustments is split toning. Now, split toning does something fairly similar to that, but rather than doing it, isolating it by color, it does it by dark parts and light parts of the frame. So the top several are the highlights section of your frame, and the lower part are your shadows portion of your frame. So the darkest part of this darkest part of this image is the bird. So if I wanted to, change the hue coming off of the bird or the dark areas of the frame, and I know that's the darkest area, I can adjust the shadows here, and you can see it changes a little bit, but there's not a whole lot of variation happening here. However, if I take the saturation, it's taking all of the dark areas and it's almost making the image start to look a little sepia toned. But the bird itself is turning kind of an awkward looking red, but it's taking a bit of that background with it as well. Highlights, same thing. If I wanted to just make the background look a little strangely red, I could adjust that using the saturation slider. And that would just affect the highlights. To be honest, I almost never use split toning. I find it easier to dodge and burn and adjust color using the brushes than trying to do it with split toning. The balance allows you to control where the algorithm decides is dark and where is light. Again, play with it. If you have an image that needs that kind of adjustment, it's a pretty useful little thing. Okay, let's see. So this image, I don't think it has a lot of noise either. There's a little bit. So see when I zoom in here, I'm going to zoom in even tighter so it's easier to see over you guys. So you can see this little, it's really not very much, zoomed into 3:1. You can see there is a bit of pixelation here in the background of the image and in the bird's bill. And, so there's a little bit of noise in this shot. And so I am going to adjust my noise slider upwards a little bit, and when I let go, watch how that changes. And it smoothed out a fair amount of that extra pixelation. If I take it up even farther, it'll get around. See there, it's almost entirely gone, but it also softened the feathers. So make sure when you're adjusting noise, you are zooming in on a place where you can see both the background or whatever wherever area you're trying to reduce the noise and some area with detail, so you can see how much you're impacting sharpness when you adjust for noise. So that's a little take home about noise reduction. If I increase the detail, you can see a little bit of that sharpness and the bird comes back. So there's detail all the way off. You can see the birds, particularly around the bird's eye here. It looks a bit soft. If I bring the detail up, you can see it brought in, retrieved some of that detail in the bird. So for this shot, I might be able to get away with a fair amount of detail and a fair amount of noise reduction and still have sufficient sharpness to make my image still look okay. I can retrieve a bit more of that detail loss by increasing the level of sharpening. It starts to look a little weird if you do it too much, though. I don't know if you guys could see, but up here on the bird's shoulder, it started to look a little strange. Yeah, anyway, so that's a little bit about sharpening. Beware there. I find that Lightroom is actually not the best tool to do sharpening and noise reduction in. It's good for small amounts. If you have a little bit of noise that you want to get rid of, or you have a little bit of sharpening that you want to do, Lightroom can be pretty effective, but I find it's not as good. Photoshop is maybe a little bit better. The best, if you shoot with a camera that's noisy at high ISOs, or you have lenses that maybe aren't as sharp as you would like, I have found that the best software available for sharpening and noise reduction is made by Topaz. They have a rather remarkable set of AI-based sharpening and noise reduction tools, and they're really, really good. A lot of my cameras are micro four thirds sensors, which are notoriously noisy, particularly when they're shot at higher ISOs. And I find you can't tell the difference between the noise in that and my full frame Sony at reasonable amounts when I'm using Topaz AI. Let's see, the programs are called Topaz Denoise AI and Topaz Sharpen AI are extraordinary programs. They're standalone, they're easy to use, but they're a little expensive. I think they're 50 to 70 bucks each, but you get to keep them forever and they have free upgrades. So if you do decide you need to do a lot more with noise reduction or sharpening, then that's a great tool. Okay, let me check for any questions. Stop the share here briefly. All right, anybody have anything else? Briefly talk about the steps? No? Okay, anybody else have anything they wanted to mention before we dive into multi-image stuff? Nope. All right, back to Lightroom.
Dave?
Oh yeah, sure, go ahead, Andrew.
Photoshop. Can you take it out of Lightroom into Photoshop? Like our Lightroom has Photoshop with it. You can take it out, but that's something that leaves me totally in the black.
Sure. So Lightroom, and actually thanks for mentioning that because that's something I meant to mention in one of the previous lectures and didn't get around to. So if there's an image that you want to work on more somewhere else. So here's an image from Gates of the Arctic National Park. If I have something particular that I want to do, if there's Lightroom's cloning tools, they're okay, but they're not that great. If I want to do some advanced cloning or there's where'd my image go? If there's something more advanced I want to do, I can, all you have to do is click on the image that you want to do. You control click or right click, depending on you're using a Mac or a PC or a PC. And then right here, there's an option for edit in. And you can say edit in Adobe Photoshop, and it will just open the image in Photoshop directly. And then you can export it back into Lightroom, the processed version. So it's not non-destructive. Once it goes into Photoshop, any changes you make are permanent. So if you save it as a TIFF or a high-res JPEG and import it back in, it'll come in as a separate file into your Lightroom catalog. But you can, anything you want to adjust in Lightroom or in Photoshop that you can't do in Lightroom, all you have to do is do edit in and it'll pop up with Photoshop. And then also if I want to, adjust it in denoise or sharpen, since I use Topaz for some images, those are my options there. So yeah, it's easy to go back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop. All right, so let's talk for a moment about HDRs. So here we have 3 images from Kluane Lake in the Yukon territories, and basically 2 are exposed the same, or more or less the same. They're slightly different, and these were exposed for the water, and then this one was exposed for the sky. So you can see how the sky is, properly exposed. It was tripod mounted, so there's no change in composition from image to image. Now, if I want to put those images together and create one image that's properly exposed throughout, it's very simple. You grab the 3 images you want to do. You right click or control click, and you go to Photo Merge, just below edit in that we talked about, and you select, so there's 3 options. There's HDR, Panorama, or HDR Panorama, and we're going to select HDR. And this new window will pop up along with a progress slider, and it's particularly on my slightly older computer, it takes a little while to get that preview generated, but it pops up here, and you can see now it looks pretty good. You can see the sky is all there, the foreground is all there, there's nothing blown up, and there's nothing pushed to blacks. So it looks pretty good. Always have auto align checked and auto settings checked. Those just make sure that all of your settings across your images are the same. And then the de-ghosting has to do with how well it blurs textural elements together. And so if you look here, so it's set, I think I can zoom in, and it doesn't allow me to zoom in very much in the preview. But you can see there's kind of these weird edges. Look up here, particularly in the waves, you can see this kind of strange thing happening. So that's where it took a chunk from one image and then a chunk from another image, and it didn't blend them seamlessly. And so that's happening here. It's particularly happening back here. And that's going to look really weird. So deghost allows you to control how much you want of that. So I'll just scroll through these. So there's the low level of deghost. It's building. Hang on. Take a second. Eventually. My poor computer's getting a little old. Feel free to kick in with questions while we're waiting for Lightroom to do its thing. Yeah, so there it's showing the areas that have deghosted, and those are the areas that it's paying attention to. So you can see the lines where portions, that is where it's grabbing all from one image. Here is areas where it's combining multiple image, all from one image, combining multiple areas. So the more you apply, I'm going to get rid of the deghost overlay, and you can see it looks better, but I'm going to go ahead and probably put this one on high. And we'll use it at that point, just to make sure that, especially with moving water, that it looks more or less seamless. And again, you can see let me see if I can do the deghost overlay. So you can see how that took most of that area and blended images together rather than trying to take sections from individual images with that moving water. So I am going to merge those guys, and a new image will pop up here. Let's see the progress bar going up here as it's doing its thing. And here's our new image. It drops in at the end of the series you were creating. And now we can go into the develop. So it created a whole new DNG file. It created a raw file out of 3 individual raw files. So I'm going to go into develop, and we'll have a look at it. So there's our image. So, and now we can just process as we want. I can zoom in on it. You can see all the elements look pretty smooth. I still have pretty good elements of water motion going on. Overall, I'd say it looks pretty decent. I really like this area. You've got nice flowing water happening here. Now there's a few red flags immediately. I know I can do more with this sky. I have got a water droplet on my lens right here dead center, which gives us a chance to talk about the cloning tool. And I have a couple of dust specks. So these are from my sensor. When you don't clean your sensor often enough, you'll inevitably get little dust specks. We'll talk about that. Well, let's talk about that right now. So if you have dust specks or other cloning things to need to get rid of, it's a good idea to probably do it early on in the processing. I'm going to go back to a less of a zoom. We're just going to go to 1:1. So let's start with this guy. So here's this water droplet dead center in my frame. I'm going to go up here to the clone tool. So that's this guy. They call it the spot correction tool. Now, in spot correction, there are 2 options. So you have clone, which will truthfully take one section of your frame and copy it and paste it over another section of your frame, exactly as it appeared there, with a feather around it. Heal will take your source part of your frame and the section that you're trying to get rid of, and we'll come up with a hybrid. So Lightroom is pretty darn good about realizing what you're trying to get rid of. I bet I use heal 80% of the time over clone, because clone is really hard to match exactly. So we'll start with clone so you can see what I'm talking about. I am going to adjust my brush, my clone setting here. I have a feather of about 50. I'm going to make it a little bigger. In fact, I'm going to take it up to about 75. And I want to size it so that the area I want to get rid of is entirely within the inner portion of that circle. So you see there's two concentric circles there. I want the inner one completely surrounding what I'm doing. So I am going to click on that, and Lightroom will automatically select a portion of my frame. Sometimes it does okay. You can see this time it grabbed half a rock. Not particularly useful to have half a rock. That really stands out as a cloned section. So I would probably more likely want something, in here, some section like that. I can line up those edges of bank, and it worked. I mean, it got rid of it. It doesn't look unnatural. You can see when I've pulled back, even when I zoom in tighter, you can't really make out where that was. There might be a slight fuzzy edge, if you knew exactly what you were looking for, where the feather was. So that worked in that particular situation. I can get away with that. Let's get rid of that though, and I'll show you what it looks like with the Hsl tool set. So I've just selected Hsl. Same settings, same other rules apply. And I'm going to click on that, and it will grab another section. I will still need to do the same thing to select a good source pixels. But unlike clone, it will make a decision about what parts to include in the new section and what parts not to, and what parts to get rid of and what parts to add in. And the general result, you can see it takes a second to decide where it's applying. But the general outcome is usually better for things like small spot removal like we just did. So we'll turn that off, and that's nearly seamless. I might, if I look really carefully, be able to see a very faint line where that feather was. But in general, I think that came out quite nicely. Now when doing, if you've got a dirty sensor, you can see this camera had a few little specks. There's one there, there's one there, there's one there, there's ones there. Particularly on things like skies or clean surfaces. If there was a speck down here in the water or in that gravel, you'd never notice it, so it doesn't matter that it's there. But in a sky, that little spot is going to stand out, particularly if I'm going to print this image. So there is a nifty little tool. So again, I'm going to go here. I've got Hsl selected. I'm going to go with a very small brush and a pretty small feather because I'm getting rid of tiny, tiny little dots. But there is a little tool down here, called Visualize Spots. See this little check mark here? If I click on that, it makes my image look really funky. But in that sky, all of those little spots that we were just looking at stand out like stars in a night sky, and becomes very obvious, and you can go through and quickly get rid of them. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to zoom in on the part of the sky I want to show you guys where it is. Go back to this tool, click on Visualize Spots, and you can see up here there are a bazillion of them. Some of them are not really noticeable within the image, but the Lightroom is capable of seeing it. So even though Lightroom is seeing a lot of them in here, and I can see them if I look carefully, the ones I'm really concerned about are these guys. They're pretty obvious, but this is a good lesson to clean your sensors. And so you can just adjust your brush to the size you want. I use Hsl on a fairly uniform surface, like we're talking about up here. You can more or less trust Lightroom to grab the portions of the frame that you want to do. Sorry, I just messed up on that one. So I'm just going to go through and get rid of a few of these as a demonstration so you guys can see what I've been talking about. There's that really troublesome one. And I am just trusting Lightroom to grab and get rid of the ones that I want to get rid of. And to choose the source pixels. And so now I'm going to turn off Visualize Spots. And I am going to turn off the clone tool. And I can see that all of those spots, let's go down here. So there they are back. and there they are gone. So pretty useful little tool. It can be pretty time consuming if you've got a dirty sensor because there are a remarkable number of those little spots that will appear on your lenses. Okay, so we're running a little low on time. That is how you create an HDR. From here, I could very quickly do whatever amounts of further editing I want. I can, correct that horizon line because I see it's a little angled. I can drop a neutral density filter on that sky to make sure it's a little darker, maybe a little less exposed. Again, very quick passes here. Maybe a little clarity up there. We can do a little bit of our HSL and maybe increase the saturation of those blues and that turquoise here. So I'm going to go here and grabbing my little eyedropper thinger here. I'm going over to the water and increasing the saturation on that particular part of the frame. Maybe I want to do the same here in those reds, make that a little brighter. And as always, when I'm finishing an image, a little bit of vignette always helps make our image look a little more professional. And so that's a sort of a quick one pass on an HDR. You can see this was a much more of a practical HDR. The HDR look where everything kind of looks a little weird, that look drives me nuts. And so I prefer this kind of image where the tones throughout look natural. It doesn't look like any part of it was, it looks like this could have been done as a single image. And so you end up with a pretty nice photo. Oops, I meant to do a before and after here. So there's our before and our after. Pretty big difference in a fairly short period of time. All right, we've got a few minutes left, so let's talk briefly about panoramas. Now, before we got rolling with the class, I had a question about white balance. And I mentioned that one of the things, and I use auto white balance on my camera in the field all the time. I don't mess with white balance. I shoot in RAW, so I can adjust white balance later. And so all of these, all the white balance stuff I do in post. But where that causes a little bit of difficulty is when you are doing a panorama, because you need to have all of your white balances throughout the image being the same in a panorama. You can do that pretty quickly in post. So let's go back to this. So there's nothing particularly wrong with that white balance. You can see right here it's set to 5950. But what I need to do is to make sure all of the images are the same. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a microscopic adjustment on this one and change it to 5957. It doesn't change the look of the image, but it does make Lightroom note that there was a temperature change. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here to copy. So it's going to take that change, copy it. It gives you the option to select what you want. I've only done one thing, so I'm going to copy all those settings. So that one change, I'm going to go back to the library, and I'm going to grab all of the images that are in that series that I want to turn into a panorama, except for the one that I just used. Go back into Develop with all of those highlighted and hit Paste. And it should have pasted those same settings into every image in your series. And so all of my white balances have gone to 5950. Although I started with 5950. Hang on, why didn't it change? Oh, okay, I have to do it one at a time. There is a way you can do batch processing, but I apparently didn't do it right. So I'll do this one at a time then. All right, develop, paste, next image, paste, 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 I'll have to remind myself how to do batch processing. I don't do these very often, so that would save me a few seconds here if I was remembering how to do the batches. I'll look that up and we'll figure it out for our next session. All right, so there's all of our images. They have all been set to the same 59-57 white balance, and now we're ready to turn them into a panorama. And so I'm going to start with this one, the first image in the series. I've grabbed them all. I am going to control click or right click, photo merge, panorama. And it does the same slow process. Let's see, I'm just checking on comments you guys had. Do you use HDR rather than neutral density filters? So Stu, it really totally depends on the kind of image I'm working with. So if I feel like I've got all the data in a single image, there's no reason to use HDR. If, however, the range of light within the photos is not enough for is too much for your sensor, so if you blow out your highlights or send your darks to pure black, then HDR is a better option. Basically, I use them for different things. If I'm looking at a scene that all of it can appear within my histogram, I don't have the histograms cut off on the right or left, then there's no reason to do an HDR. Time-lapse, Fletcher, sure, we can talk about that in a future lesson. It's a little more complex, but we can do that. Certainly, I can pull up some images to create a time-lapse. Photo was, Andrew asks if that series was done with a tripod. Actually, I think this was handheld. It makes it a little trickier, but if you have a lot of overlap between images, so generally in a panorama, you want to overlap at least 30%, and 50% is better. If you do that, even if you're not using a tripod, you can still get it to come out. You can tell I haven't used a tripod here because see how this edge is see how that little waffly thing happens there on the top and bottom? That's where the multiple images were coming together. Okay, so we've merged our panorama, and you can see the edges were imperfect, but fortunately Lightroom provides an option called the boundary warp, which allows you to slide that up and it will make the decision on where to add canvas and where to subtract and where to crop it to make a full rectangle. You can also do a crop later. It also gives you the option to auto crop. So if I took the boundary warp off and selected auto crop, it does something kind of similar, but you lose a little bit of data around the edges. So I often go with boundary warp. I find on images with sky or things like this, it actually looks just fine when it comes together. There are 3 different options for creating these. It will automatically decide which Lightroom thinks is appropriate. Spherical is when it's an up and down panorama. So if you were doing, a skyscraper or a redwood tree or something like that with multiple images from top to bottom, you'd want to use spherical. Cylindrical is a horizontal. And perspective, I don't honestly know what it does. Lightroom tends to know, and so I rarely select different ones in this area. You can see that came out pretty darn well. I'm going to merge those. We got our progress bar here. Let's see what got here going on in the chat. Yep, all right. So, all right, so the panorama is being created as we go here, and it'll pop up here in a moment. Anybody have questions while that's merging? You can see that's a pretty big file. Each one of these images used to create that is 3840 by 5760 pixels. So that was like I think this was with a 5D a couple of years ago, 5D Mark II or 3, I think. And so it was a 24 megapixel camera. And so you can see with all of those images, there's how many images are there? 6, 12, 13. Yeah, 12 images going together. That's going to create an enormous file. And so it takes Lightroom a little while to make that, make those connections and create the image that we're going for. So we'll just let it do its thing here for a second while we're waiting. does anybody have questions? Anything else that we wanted to talk about? Anything else? I'm happy to. What is the difference between A and B brush? Oh, good. Eleanor, so in your brush tool, and anybody in Lightroom will be able to see there is two options within your brush. Let's open that up. Let me just grab a photo. So in your brush tool, oh no, spinning pinwheel of death. There are two options for A and B, and that allows you to preset two different brush types. So if you have, if you want to do one that's a small brush with a small level of feather, and one that's a big brush with a big level of feather, rather than adjusting things, you can just click back and forth between them, and A and B will allow you to just have two different brushes set into your system, so you don't need to constantly adjust sizes or feathers depending on the kind of work you want to do. You can just switch between A and B. I do it a little bit, but honestly, I just usually just take the time and adjust my brush for what I need it to. All right, looks like that panorama's about done. Okay, panorama's done. Back here. All right, so here's the panorama we just created. And again, just like in an HDR, you can see it is huge, 23,165 pixels by 5,882 pixels. That's an enormous image. You could print that, to I don't know how big, but big. And there's the photo we've just created. And it's a DNG file, so it has all the same capabilities to play with it as any other image in your collection. You can crop these guys a lot because they are so big. Every little, this is like, there's an image and there's an image and there's an image. So you can crop a lot out of these guys. And that's often necessary because compositionally, they, panoramas can be a little awkward sometimes. So, I can nick a little bit of that sky off. Maybe I think there's a little bit too much mud here in the foreground. Maybe I want to just adjust it this way. So we can do some adjustments pretty quickly. I actually don't like that. All right, so there's a nice little thing. Here's my shadow in the corner of it. Maybe I don't want that, so let's go into our clone tool. We'll select heal, select a fairly large feather, a bit bigger. And the other thing about the clone tool I didn't talk about is that you don't have to do just a single click. You can click and drag. So I'm going to click and I'm going to drag down the length of that shadow, creating a long horizontal clone area. Lightroom will probably do a pretty good job of grabbing the area right next to it. And shadow gone. If I know where to look, I can see a little bit of that feathered edge right here. I could probably go back and get rid of that by pulling the size of the feather down a little bit, making it a little crisper edge. But the fact of the matter is, on an image of that size, no one is going to notice a few pixels off. Unless I was to print it at 100%, which, let's be honest, I probably won't. And from here, you can do all the adjustments you want. So you can add filters, you can add, you can adjust it however you want to do it. You can increase the saturation and the vibrance, and make your image look however you want to, except now it's a huge panorama. So that is the long and short of creating panoramas and multi-image HDRs. The one thing we didn't get to today was presets. If anybody wants to linger on a little bit, let me stop my screen share here. We can talk briefly about presets. I don't use them very often, but they, there's some interesting things out there, I guess. So did anybody have questions for me about what we covered today, or anything else that they, want to throw in their 2 cents for a future class, since we're, we've covered a fair amount of Lightroom in the last 3 days. So go ahead, Andrew.
Cleaning your sensor. Like, I get quite a few dots on my, especially underwater. Some of it's floating around in the water, but where you've got the sky, as you say, a lot of dots sometimes.
Yep.
So should I get it professionally done or?
Okay, you know, I find for most general use, simply using a good puffer, you know, a strong, like a rocket blower, you know, one of these big hand blowers, will blow off most of the dust off of the sensor if you do it. I do mine, you know, when I'm doing a shoot, when I'm shooting a lot, I'll do that every few days probably, especially since I shoot mirrorless cameras these days. They're a lot more prone to getting dust on them than you know the standard DSLRs, and so I'm often blowing out my sensors. You know, I'll do it every other evening on a trip where especially if I'm changing lenses a lot. If you're not changing lenses a lot, you're probably not going to build a lot of dust. If you want to do a full-on cleaning, there are some really good tools out there. It's best to have somebody who knows what they're doing teach you. It can be extremely nerve-wracking to take a literal brush and wipe it across a sensor of a $3,000 camera. It will give you a heart attack if you think you've done it wrong. It also is a little bit finicky. You have to have the right size brushes for the right size sensors, so you have to make sure you're ordering the right things. But once you learn how to do it, it's pretty straightforward. There's a pretty, I can't remember the name, I think it's called Senso Brush or something like that. I can send you an email with the link to it. But it's just a little single-use disposable wipe. You add a little bit of fluid on it that's designed for the sensor, and you take one streak across your sensor, and it takes care of the problem. So it's not too hard to do once you learn how to do it, but find somebody you trust to show you for the first time. It'll make you feel better.
Well, guess what you're going to be doing when we see you next time?
All right. Well, when this pandemic ends and you guys can get back to Alaska, we'll talk about that. But I suspect your sensor's going to need cleaned between now and then. So, but you know, if you take it to a good camera shop or something like that, they can probably walk you through it too. So, all right. Anybody else has anything they wanted to talk about? Does Lightroom not recognize Olympus lenses when you have an extension on them? Good question, Eleanor. So that's not a question of Lightroom. It is the question of whether or not your camera. So if you're using like a Metabones converter on your Olympus camera, your Olympus may not be able to read the kind of lens that you've got attached to that Metabones converter, and so same would be an extension tubes or an off-brand. An off-brand teleconverter. So yeah, that Lightroom, if it's not recorded in the metadata of your image, then Lightroom won't be able to pick it up. Anybody else?
Are you recording this one as well?
Yep, it's recording. I'll post it.
Beautiful. Yes.
So. All right. Well, feel free to log out if you want. I will linger on here for a second and briefly go over presets. So if you don't have anything to do and you want to hang out for another 5 or 10 minutes, then we'll talk briefly about presets. But otherwise, again, my feelings won't be hurt if you take off. So take care, Tom, Fletcher. You guys are signing out, and we will see you again next time. All right. So let's dive into presets very briefly. This is not something I use a lot, but there are some interesting things here. So let's go back to our library module. Let's pull up this guy that we worked on last time. And over here on the left side of the frame, one of the options is presets. Now, Lightroom comes with a bunch of presets. There are things about, they call them all kinds of different things. Color adjustments, black and white adjustments, curves, grains, sharpening, vignettings. All this sort of stuff are already built into Lightroom. There are also a bunch that are either available for download for free or for paying. Some photographers seem to make money by creating their own presets. And you can do that too. If you have a particular way that you tend to process images with a certain amount of sharpening, a certain amount of clarity, you can save your settings as a preset. And I would honestly have to look up how to do that because I don't do it. But you can do it. I'm sure it's pretty straightforward. Once you have a certain amount of settings, you can apply them and then save them as a preset. But what Lightroom will allow you to do, I'm going to try to make So look up here on the preview, here on the top upper left corner. You can see as I scroll over, and actually it's applying them to the main bear too, it will apply different preset settings to that. And you can kind of see what it looks. So, there's kind of an old slide look. It's kind of interesting, actually, that matte format. So go ahead. No? Okay. So, this takes a desaturated, which presumably reduces the saturation a little bit to kind of give it this, maybe almost a little bit of a sepia toned look. So you can scroll through these and there's a bunch of different just kind of looks that the image will create. Now, I find what I like about presets, the only thing I really like about presets, because I don't like applying somebody else's vision to my image, is that it gives you ideas and starting points. So if there's something in here that I like, so if they're, especially like with black and whites, if you're just learning about black and white conversions and black and white settings, having Lightroom make some choices for you might give you some starting points on where to look for things. But let's go back to this one that I thought was interesting called matte. So it kind of looks like a slide. So I am going to hit that right there. And I have applied that to my image. Now, if I go over here, basically what that did was apply some settings to my image. It adjusted the stuff going on over here in the highlights and the shadows and the color. You can see it moved the saturation downwards. It probably did some localized adjustments here. Oh, no, it didn't. Maybe it did in the saturation. No. But you can see it applied that. And then from there, you can say, I like that, but I wish I had more clarity. And so I can move that clarity slider. Or you can say, I wish I had less clarity and make it look like I've thrown a blur filter or something over my image. So it gives you this freedom to take an image, get some ideas for how you might want to look, and then fine tune it to however your vision for that image is. So, I think that particular shot definitely needs more in the, oops, let me turn that off. I feel like that got too dark here, so I'm going to go take some brushing and, brush in the bear a little bit and add a little bit of exposure. And, now I can see a little bit more of that detail. So that's the kind of thing that that presets do. There are some photographers out there, like I said, who sell theirs commercially. And to be honest, there are some really interesting settings out there that are available. Some guys have done these really interesting things with like high contrast and dramatic blues, and and they're really good for different situations. So there will be presets that are just for snowy landscapes that will apply very specific settings that tend to work however that photographer thought they were going to work for a particular setting, like a stormy mountain in the winter, and to provide those sort of different tones. So anyway, those are some of the things that's what the presets are. That's where they're found. And like I said, I don't really use them very often, but they are kind of interesting, particularly as you're learning Lightroom. You can just apply those to your images, see something you like, and then adjust it. And it'll help you learn what the different settings and sliders within Lightroom will allow you to do, and how they can affect your image. So, all right, Andrew, I see you next week there. Yep, we'll probably do another one next week. I'm going to send out an email because I've got a little bit different idea for how we're going to do next week. Basically, I want you guys to send me some images and ones that you've had issues with. I know some of you guys, Elaine has sent me an image to look at. So if you have images that you have been confused about, or you just want my take on how I might process it, then I think that's part of what we're going to do next week. And that'll be 4 lessons in Lightroom. And I think that might be about all we can cover in Lightroom. And then maybe we can come up with something else to talk about after that.